He had been walking for days, not knowing where the road would end, if it would lead anywhere at all. Robert Hayes carried more than hunger and exhaustion. He carried memories that refused to let him sleep. Then, deep in the forest, he found a small, quiet house, no lights, no sound, just a door left waiting. He thought it was just a place to rest for the night. But that night was only the beginning of something he didn't see coming. Before we begin, if you want to know what happens next, take 2 seconds to sign up and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. These stories survive because you're here. The forest breathed cold and quiet beneath a dim gray sky, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest and reminded him how alone he truly was. Robert Hayes moved slowly along the narrow trail, each step measured, not out of caution, but exhaustion. At 48, his tall, lean frame still carried the remnants of strength from another life, but it had been worn thin by years of wandering. His face was angular, marked by sharp cheekbones and a tired, weathered expression. A short, uneven layer of salt and pepper stubble clung to his jaw, and his dark brown hair, once kept neat under military discipline, now fell slightly messy, streaked with gray. His eyes, a muted hazel, never stayed still for long. They scanned, calculated, remembered. There had been a time when Robert Hayes knew exactly where to look. Back then, he had been a Marine. Orders were clear. The world made sense, even in chaos. But that life had ended abruptly. One night, one mission that went wrong, one moment he replayed in his mind without mercy. Since then, the world had lost its edges. Everything blurred into long roads, empty days, and nights that refused to end. Sleep, when it came, arrived in fragments, never deep, never kind. Beside him walked Rusty. The German shepherd was 6 years old, large and steady, his coat a mix of gray and white tones that caught the dull forest light in soft contrasts. His amber eyes held a calm intelligence, always watching, always aware. He moved with quiet confidence, neither rushing ahead nor falling behind, as if he understood that his place was exactly at Robert's side. Rusty did not need commands anymore. He had learned Robert's rhythms, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle shifts in his breathing, the moments when silence meant danger and when it meant something else entirely. If Robert was still moving forward, it was because Rusty never stopped walking. The path beneath them was uneven, scattered with roots and damp leaves that clung to worn boots. Robert hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. His body reminded him of that with every step, slow, heavy, unforgiving. Hunger was familiar, though. It was the quiet things that unsettled him more. The sudden stillness. The way the forest sometimes felt like it was watching him. He paused, not because he wanted to, but because his legs no longer listened. A dull ache spread through his chest, and he leaned slightly forward, catching his breath. Rusty stopped immediately, turning his head just enough to look back at him. There was no panic in the dog's expression, only patience. "I'm good," Robert muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The words felt unnecessary. Rusty didn't need them. They stood like that for a moment, man and dog, suspended in the quiet weight of the forest. Somewhere in the distance, wind moved through the trees in a low, restless whisper. It sounded almost like memory. Robert straightened slowly and forced himself forward again. He didn't know where he was going. He hadn't known for a long time. There had been places once, temporary stops, borrowed rooms, shelters that never quite felt like shelter. But nothing held him, nothing stayed. The world had become something he passed through, not something he belonged to, until the forest opened. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift. The trees thinned, the ground leveled, and the air felt different. Robert slowed again, this time not from exhaustion, but from something else, something unfamiliar. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Ahead of him, partially hidden by the land itself, was a shape that didn't belong to the forest, yet didn't resist it either. It rose gently from the earth, low and rounded, its surface blending into the surrounding soil and dry grass. There were no sharp edges, no clear lines. It looked less like something built and more like something that had grown there over time. Rusty took a few steps forward, ears slightly raised, his body alert but not tense. Robert followed, slower. As he got closer, details began to form. The texture of packed earth, faint traces of straw woven into the surface. A small weathered door set quietly into the curve of the structure. A house. Robert stopped a few feet away. He stared at it, his expression unreadable, though something had shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it wasn't nothing either. A place like this didn't belong out here. Or maybe it did. His mind moved quickly, instinct returning in fragments. Questions, risks, possibilities. Who built it? Was it abandoned? Was it safe? Every answer felt uncertain, and uncertainty had cost him too much before. Rusty glanced back at him again, then toward the door, waiting. Robert exhaled slowly. For a moment, he considered walking away. It would have been easier, safer in a way. The road, at least, was familiar in its emptiness. But his body didn't move, because somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, beneath the memories he never spoke of, beneath the long stretch of years he had spent surviving instead of living, something in him had already made a choice. Robert took one step forward, then another, and stopped just before the door. He stood there, silent, breathing slow, as if the moment itself carried more weight than anything he had faced in a long time. Then, without saying a word, he reached out and moved closer. The door creaked inward with a low, tired sound, as if it had not been opened in a very long time. Robert Hayes stood still for a moment at the threshold, his body tense out of habit, his eyes scanning every corner of the dim interior before allowing himself to step inside. The air was different here, still, dry, and strangely balanced, neither warm nor cold. It didn't carry the usual scent of decay he expected from abandoned places. Instead, it smelled faintly of earth, like soil after rain. That alone unsettled him more than rot ever could. He moved slowly, boots pressing softly against the compacted floor. The space was small but carefully arranged. Thick, curved walls formed a natural shell around the interior, with shallow alcoves carved into them. One held a folded blanket, another a few clay containers, another a stack of old but neatly arranged firewood. There was no sign of chaos, no signs of struggle. Whoever had lived here had left the place with intention. Robert's gaze lingered on details longer than necessary. That was how he survived now, by noticing what others ignored. Rusty slipped in behind him, his movement quiet but deliberate. The dog paused near the center of the room, nose low, taking in the scent of the place. His ears flicked once, then again, picking up something Robert couldn't hear. Rusty's posture shifted, not alarmed, but alert, like he had found something worth attention. Robert exhaled slowly. "Clear," he muttered under his breath, though he knew better than to trust first impressions. His body was already giving in. The adrenaline that had carried him this far drained away, leaving only exhaustion behind. His legs felt heavy, his shoulders slumped, and the dull ache in his chest returned stronger than before. He scanned once more, slower this time, then walked toward one of the alcoves. The blanket there was worn but clean. That was enough. Robert lowered himself down with a quiet groan, his back pressing against the curved wall. The surface was firm but not uncomfortable. He hadn't intended to sleep, not yet, but his body had already made the decision for him. His eyes closed before his mind could argue. Sleep came fast, too fast. And then, a sound, not subtle, not imagined, sharp, repetitive, real. Robert's eyes snapped open. His body reacted before his thoughts could catch up. He pushed himself upright in one quick motion, muscles tightening, breath shallow, every sense pulled into focus. For a split second, he didn't know where he was, and that was the most dangerous moment of all. The sound came again, scraping, from the floor. Robert turned his head sharply. Rusty. The dog was crouched low, front paws digging insistently at a section of the floor near the center of the room. His movements were focused, almost urgent, but not panicked. He wasn't reacting to danger, he was trying to uncover something. His claws struck against the surface again and again, each scrape louder in the quiet space. "Hey," Robert started, his voice rough from disuse. Rusty didn't stop. The floor there wasn't loose dirt. It was compacted, hardened, intentionally packed. But after several determined scrapes, something shifted. A thin layer cracked just enough to reveal a narrow edge beneath it. Rusty adjusted his stance, then dug harder. The sound changed, from dull scraping to something hollow. Robert's eyes narrowed. He pushed himself forward, ignoring the protest in his body, and crouched beside the dog. "Move," he said quietly, though there was no force behind it. Rusty stepped back immediately, but his gaze stayed fixed on the spot, tail still, ears forward. Robert brushed away the loose debris with his hand. Beneath it, partially hidden, was something that didn't belong to the floor at all. A corner, flat, man-made. He dug a little deeper, fingers working through the packed surface until he could grip it properly. With a short pull, the object came free. Dust fell away in soft clouds as it emerged into the dim light. A notebook, old, worn, bound in cracked leather that had darkened with age and use. The edges of the pages were yellowed, uneven, but intact. Robert held it in both hands for a moment without opening it. Rusty stepped closer, lowering his head slightly, watching him. There was something almost expectant in the dog's posture, as if he understood that this object mattered in a way Robert had not yet grasped. Robert glanced at him briefly, then back at the notebook. His fingers tightened slightly around the cover. Something about it felt deliberate, not lost, not forgotten, hidden. He opened it. The first page creaked softly under the movement. The handwriting inside was small, careful, consistent, the kind of writing that came from someone who took their time, someone who thought before they acted. Robert read the first few lines, then the next. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes did. The tension shifted. The sharp edge of alertness softened into something quieter, understanding. The entries weren't random. They weren't notes for survival or records of supplies. They were about people, names, dates, short lines, some barely more than a sentence. He stayed one night, left at dawn, walked steadier than he arrived. She didn't speak at first, cried before she slept, left food behind before she went. Boy, maybe 10, didn't trust me, trusted the dog. Robert's fingers stilled on the page. His breath slowed. He turned another page, and another. Each line carried the same quiet pattern. Someone arrived. Someone was helped. Someone left. No explanations. No praise. Just continuation. Robert closed the notebook halfway, his thumb still holding his place. The room felt different now. Not empty, not abandoned, but used. For something that hadn't ended, only paused. He looked down at Rusty. The dog met his gaze calmly. For the first time since stepping into the forest, Robert understood. This place wasn't just a shelter. It had been something else, something that had kept people going, people like him. Robert Hayes sat near the center of the small earthen room, the notebook resting heavy in his hands as if it carried more than ink and paper. The dim light filtering through the narrow openings in the curved walls fell softly across the pages, enough to read, not enough to distract. Rusty lay a few feet away, his body relaxed but his eyes half open, watching without seeming to. The forest outside had grown quieter, or perhaps Robert had simply stopped hearing it the way he did before. The words in front of him pulled him inward, into something slower, steadier, and far more dangerous than the unknown, something that asked him to stay. He turned the page carefully. The handwriting remained consistent, controlled, deliberate. Whoever had written this had not rushed. There were no long stories, no explanations, only fragments of lives passing through. But as Robert read more, the fragments began to form a pattern. The entries weren't about survival in the way he understood it. They were about people arriving broken in ways that didn't show on the surface, and leaving, just slightly less so. That was the only difference. Not miracles, not transformation, just enough to keep going. A new section began several pages in, marked not by a title, but by a change in tone. The writing grew firmer, less observational, more certain. The first line stood alone on the page. If they stay too long, they will not leave. Robert frowned slightly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the notebook. He read on. The writer explained, not emotionally, not defensively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned the lesson the hard way. People who arrived here were often at their lowest, tired, lost. Some of them had nowhere else to go, and that was exactly the problem. If they were allowed to stay, truly stay, they would begin to rely on this place instead of rebuilding their lives beyond it. They would trade one form of being lost for another, safer, quieter, but still a kind of disappearance. Robert exhaled slowly. That part he understood immediately. He had lived it. Not in a house like this, but in the long stretches of nothing between places. The longer he stayed nowhere, the harder it became to move again. The less reason he had to try. It wasn't comfort that trapped a man, it was the absence of pressure, the slow fading of purpose. He turned another page. There were entries now that reflected that rule in practice. Names followed by short notes. Told him to leave in the morning. He didn't want to. He left anyway. She asked to stay through winter. I said no. She cried. She still left. Hardest part is not helping too much. Robert's jaw tightened slightly at that line. Helping too much. It sounded wrong at first. It went against instinct, against everything a man like him had once been trained to do. You helped. You stayed. You didn't leave people behind. That was the rule. That was the code. But this was different. This wasn't about leaving someone behind. It was about making sure they didn't stop moving forward. Robert leaned back slightly against the curved wall, the notebook resting loosely in his lap now. His mind drifted, not to the forest, not to the present, but to moments he tried not to revisit. People he couldn't help. People he stayed too long with. People who never got back up. He shut his eyes briefly, then opened them again, forcing himself back to the page. The final entries were fewer. The handwriting remained steady, but there was something quieter about them. Less explanation, more acceptance. No one came for 3 days. Firewood holding. Cold getting worse. Then, nothing. The next page was blank. Robert stared at it for a long moment, as if expecting more words to appear if he waited long enough. But the silence remained. The man who had written this had not said goodbye. He had simply stopped. Robert closed the notebook slowly. The sound was soft, final in a way that settled heavily in the room. Rusty shifted slightly, lifting his head. His ears flicked once, then relaxed again. The room felt different now, not just used, as Robert had thought before, but unfinished, like something had been set down in the middle of its purpose and never picked back up again. Robert looked around the space more carefully this time. The blanket, the shelves, the wood. Everything was in place, maintained, preserved, not abandoned in chaos, abandoned in pause. He ran a hand over his face, rough fingers dragging across tired skin. "If they stay too long," he murmured quietly, the words barely audible. His gaze drifted toward the door, then back to the notebook in his hands, then to Rusty. The dog watched him steadily, as if waiting, not for a command, but for a decision. Robert didn't move. Not yet. But something inside him had shifted again. Not enough to change anything. Not yet. But enough to make one thing clear. This place had not just been built to survive. It had been built with purpose. And that purpose had been left behind. The silence inside the small earthen house no longer felt empty. It settled differently now, less like abandonment, more like something waiting. Robert Hayes remained seated near the center of the room, the notebook resting in his hands, its worn edges pressing faintly against his fingers. He had stopped turning pages, but he hadn't put it down. The words lingered in his mind, not as sentences, but as traces, fragments of lives that had passed through this place and continued beyond it. Rusty lay nearby, his body stretched along the curve of the wall, breathing slow and steady, a quiet presence that filled the room without effort. Robert opened the notebook again, not from curiosity this time, but from something closer to necessity. He flipped back through the earlier entries, slower now, reading not just what was written, but how it was written. Some lines were neat, carefully spaced, as if the writer had time. Others were rushed, the ink slightly heavier in places, like the words had been written quickly before something or someone left. A few entries were barely more than a sentence, yet they carried weight that stayed long after the page turned. Gratitude, though never stated directly, lived between the lines. He paused at one entry, shorter than most. Didn't think he'd make it. He did. Robert stared at it longer than necessary. There was no name, no explanation, just that single line. But it was enough. He could picture the man, whoever he had been, tired, broken, maybe sitting in this same spot, unsure if he could take another step forward. And yet, somehow, he had. Robert exhaled slowly and closed the notebook again, this time more firmly. His eyes lifted, scanning the room once more. The blanket in the alcove, the carefully stacked wood, the clay containers. Nothing here was excessive. Nothing here was meant to keep someone comfortable forever. It was just enough. Just enough to rest. Just enough to breathe. Just enough to stand up again. "That's what this was," he muttered under his breath. "Not a home, a place in between." His gaze drifted toward the door. Beyond it, the forest stretched endlessly, cold, uncertain, familiar in the worst ways. That was the direction he had always gone, forward, but never anywhere. If he left now, nothing would change. The thought didn't come with fear. It came with clarity. He would keep walking, keep surviving, keep drifting from one place to another until the days blurred into each other so completely that they stopped meaning anything at all. Robert rubbed a hand over his face, the roughness of his skin grounding him in the moment. Then he looked back at the notebook. If he left, this place would go quiet again. Not just empty, forgotten. The kind of forgotten that erased purpose, not just presence. Rusty lifted his head slightly, watching him. The dog's amber eyes were steady, calm, but attentive in a way that felt almost knowing. His ears twitched once, then settled again. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. Robert met his gaze. For years, decisions had felt like something that happened to him. Circumstances, consequences, reactions. But this felt different. This felt like something that required him. Not as a soldier, not as a man trying to survive, but as someone who could choose to stay. Robert shifted his weight, pushing himself up slowly to his feet. His legs protested, stiff from exhaustion, but he steadied himself against the curved wall. The room looked smaller from standing, but somehow more real. He took a step toward the alcove, picked up the blanket, folded it more neatly than it had been before. It was a small thing, meaningless almost. But it was the first thing he had done in a long time that wasn't about leaving. Rusty stood as well, stretching briefly before moving closer to him. The dog's tail swayed once, slow and quiet. Robert let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he looked around the room again, this time not as someone passing through, but as someone seeing what needed to be kept. For the first time in years, Robert Hayes did not move toward the door. He stayed. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of pale, muted light that slipped through the narrow openings of the earthen walls without announcing itself. Robert Hayes woke before he fully realized he had slept. For a moment, he lay still, his body tense out of habit, waiting for the familiar rush of disorientation to follow. It didn't come the way it usually did. There was no sudden jolt, no immediate need to scan for exits, no sharp pull of memory dragging him backward, just a slow awareness of where he was. The curved ceiling above him, the faint scent of earth, the steady, even sound of Rusty breathing nearby. He pushed himself up slowly, muscles stiff but responsive. The air inside the house held a quiet consistency that felt reliable. Not warm in a comforting way, not cold in a threatening way, just steady. Robert noticed that immediately. Stability was something he had not felt in a long time, and now that it was here, even in this small form, it unsettled him slightly. Rusty lifted his head as Robert moved, stretching his front legs forward before standing. The dog shook out his coat once, then walked a slow circle around the room, nose brushing lightly against the ground and walls. It wasn't nervous movement, it was routine, as if he were confirming that everything remained as it should be. His amber eyes flicked toward Robert briefly, then back to the space around them. Robert stood, glancing toward the alcoves again. In the daylight, the imperfections were clearer. A small crack ran along one section of the wall where the packed earth had begun to separate. The stack of firewood was slightly uneven, some pieces worn thinner than others. One of the clay containers had a chipped rim, its surface rough where it had broken. None of it was critical, but none of it had been maintained either. He moved without thinking too much about it. First, the wood. He crouched beside the stack and adjusted it, placing the heavier pieces at the bottom, aligning them so they wouldn't shift. It was a simple task, one he had done countless times before in different places, under different conditions. His hands worked automatically, muscle memory guiding the movements. Then, the wall. He pressed his fingers lightly against the cracked section, testing its stability. The outer layer flaked slightly under pressure. Not dangerous yet, but it would become a problem if left alone. Robert stepped back, scanning the room again, this time not as a temporary occupant, but as someone responsible for what happened next. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like the morning light. Rusty moved to the doorway, sitting just inside it, facing outward. His posture was relaxed, but attentive, guarding in his own quiet way. He had taken that role naturally, without command, without instruction. Robert noticed it. "Yeah," he muttered softly. we stay." The words felt strange out loud, not because they were uncertain, but because they were final in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. He stepped outside briefly, scanning the clearing. The forest remained still, unchanged. No movement, no immediate threats, just distance. Endless distance. Then he went back inside. The next task came without planning. He picked up the blanket again, this time shaking it lightly to remove the dust that had settled into its fibers. He folded it carefully, more precisely than before, then placed it back into the alcove. Small things, one after another. Hours passed without him noticing the time. Adjusting, cleaning, reinforcing. Each action was simple, almost insignificant on its own. But together, they formed something he hadn't experienced in a long while. Continuity. Rusty followed him through it all, not interfering, not demanding attention, just present. When Robert moved, the dog moved. When Robert stopped, Rusty settled nearby, watching with quiet understanding. By late afternoon, the changes were subtle but visible. The wood was stable, the blanket clean, the space ordered. Not perfect, not new, but cared for. Robert stood in the center of the room again, looking around. Nothing about it was impressive, but it no longer felt abandoned. And somewhere in the repetition of those small tasks, something inside him had shifted as well. The constant weight he carried, the one that pressed against his chest, his thoughts, his every movement, felt lighter. Not gone, never gone, but quieter. For the first time in years, Robert Hayes was not just enduring the day, he was part of it. The door stayed open more often now, not wide, not inviting in any obvious way, but no longer closed against the world. Robert Hayes never placed a sign, never marked a path, never left anything behind to guide others in. And yet, over time, people began to arrive. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things in the forest did, quietly, without announcement, as if those who needed the place simply found it when they could no longer keep going without it. Rusty noticed them before Robert ever did. The dog would lift his head, ears angling toward a direction where no sound had yet reached human hearing, his body shifting from rest into quiet readiness. That was always how it began. The first man arrived just before dusk on a day when the cold had settled deeper into the trees. His name, Robert later learned, was Daniel Brooks, a man in his early 50s, tall but hollowed by exhaustion, his shoulders sloping inward as if he had spent too long carrying something he could not put down. His beard was uneven, streaked with gray, his skin windburned and pale beneath the dirt. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from cold and fatigue layered together over time. He didn't speak when he first reached the doorway. He just stood there, breathing hard, as if unsure whether he had the strength to take one more step. Robert didn't ask questions. He stepped aside. Daniel entered slowly, his movements cautious, eyes scanning the interior in the same way Robert's once had. Rusty approached him first, not close enough to threaten, not distant enough to ignore, just enough to be present. Daniel hesitated, then lowered his hand slightly. Rusty sniffed it once, then settled nearby. That was all it took. Robert handed him a bowl of warm food, simple, nothing more than what the house allowed. But Daniel held it like it mattered. His hands shook as he ate, each movement deliberate, controlled, as if he were trying not to spill more than he could afford to lose. He stayed one night, left at first light. Didn't say much, but he stood straighter when he walked out than when he came in. Days passed. Then someone else arrived. Her name was Evelyn Carter, a woman in her mid-40s with a narrow, fragile frame that looked as though it had been worn down over time rather than built that way. Her hair, once dark, had begun to thin at the temples, strands pulled back loosely as if she no longer cared how it looked. Her skin carried a pale, almost translucent quality, marked by faint lines that came from more than age. She moved carefully, as though every step required consideration. When she entered the house, she didn't speak. She simply sat near the wall, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Robert didn't ask why she was there. He gave her space, food, a place to rest. For hours, she said nothing. Not even when Rusty settled a few feet away, watching her with quiet patience. The silence stretched long enough that it became something else, something heavy, waiting. Then, without warning, Evelyn broke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet collapse inward, shoulders shaking, breath uneven, tears falling without restraint. She covered her face with both hands, as if trying to hide from something that had already found her. Robert didn't move closer. He stayed where he was. That was enough. She stayed one night, left the next morning without looking back. And then there was the child. He arrived near midday, small and thin, no older than 10. His name was Caleb Reed. His clothes hung loosely on him, worn and mismatched, his shoes too large, tied tightly to keep them from slipping off. His hair was light brown, cut unevenly, as if done without a mirror. His eyes were sharp, alert in a way children should not need to be, watching everything, trusting nothing. He carried a torn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, gripping the strap tightly as if it were the only thing he had that was truly his. He didn't step inside right away. He stood at the edge of the doorway, studying Robert, studying Rusty, calculating something beyond his years. Rusty approached first again, slower this time, lowering his body slightly, reducing his size without losing presence. The dog stopped just short of the boy, sitting calmly, waiting. Caleb hesitated, then stepped forward. Robert handed him food. The boy took it without speaking, ate quickly, but not carelessly, every movement controlled, as if he had learned not to waste anything, not even time. He stayed one night, left at dawn. Didn't say where he was going, but he didn't look lost when he left. The pattern repeated. Not every day, not even every week, but enough. Robert never asked for names unless they offered them, never asked where they came from, never asked where they were going. He gave them what the house had always given: food, rest, time. And when they left, they carried something with them that they had not brought in. Robert saw it in small ways, in how they stood, in how they looked at the road ahead, not fixed, not saved, but no longer at the edge of breaking. And that was enough. Winter settled deeper into the forest, but the house no longer felt like something hidden from the world. It remained quiet, still blending into the earth as it always had, but its purpose had begun to move beyond its walls. Robert Hayes noticed it not through noise or attention, but through a subtle shift in the kind of people who arrived. They no longer came only at the edge of collapse. Some came earlier now, before they broke completely, as if somewhere along the unseen paths beyond the trees something had been said, passed from one person to another, not as a direction, but as a memory of a place that did not turn anyone away. Robert never confirmed it. He didn't need to. The pattern held. A man named Lucas Warren arrived one afternoon, his posture rigid, his jaw set tight as if he had spent too long holding himself together by force alone. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, but worn down in a way that strength alone could not hide. His hair was cut short, uneven, like he had done it himself. A faint scar ran along his cheekbone, not fresh, but not forgotten either. He spoke little, but his eyes moved constantly, assessing everything, every angle, every exit. The kind of man who had learned the hard way that safety was never guaranteed. Robert recognized that immediately. Lucas stayed one night, didn't say thank you, didn't need to. When he left, his shoulders had dropped just enough to show that he no longer felt like he had to fight everything at once. Days later, a woman named Mariah Collins arrived near dusk. She was younger than the others, late 20s maybe, but her eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that didn't belong to her age. She had long dark hair tied loosely behind her neck, strands falling free around her face, and her skin held a dull, pale tone as if she hadn't seen enough daylight. She moved carefully, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. When she spoke, her voice was soft, measured, as though she was unsure whether it would be heard or dismissed. Rusty approached her the same way he always did, steady, patient, without expectation. She reached down to touch him, hesitating only briefly before her hand settled into the thick fur along his neck. Her shoulders eased almost immediately. She stayed one night, left before sunrise. But she looked back once, just once, before stepping into the trees again. Robert noticed that too. The days passed in quiet repetition. Open door, warm food, a place to rest, then departure. Nothing changed on the surface. The house remained small, simple, limited in what it could offer. But something beneath that simplicity had grown stronger. And so had Robert. He still woke in the night sometimes, his breath uneven, his mind pulling him back into moments he could not rewrite. The memories had not disappeared. They likely never would. But they no longer held him the way they used to. They passed through him now, like the cold wind outside, felt but not permanent. Rusty remained constant through it all. The dog aged in small, quiet ways, slower to rise some mornings, more deliberate in his steps, but his presence never wavered. He still watched the door, still listened before Robert could hear, still stayed close enough to remind him that he was not alone, even when the nights grew long again. One evening, as the light faded and the forest settled into its familiar stillness, Robert stood just inside the doorway, looking out across the clearing. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, covering the ground in a thin, even layer. He didn't feel the need to leave. That was new. For years, movement had been survival. Standing still had meant danger, being found, being trapped, being pulled back into something he couldn't face. But now, standing here, in a place that had once belonged to someone else, then to no one at all, he felt something different. Not comfort, something quieter. Enough. He glanced back inside, the firewood stacked, the blanket folded, the space ready for whoever might arrive next. A place that worked, a place that mattered. Robert exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering without effort. Each day he kept the door open. He helped someone take one step forward. And somewhere in those same days, without forcing it, without chasing it, he had taken steps forward too. Not away from the past, but through it. And in the quiet rhythm of giving what he could, Robert Hayes had found something he hadn't believed he would ever feel again. Peace, not as an ending, but as something he could return to, again and again, right here. Like Robert, sometimes the miracle isn't sudden. It's the quiet way God works through small acts of kindness in our daily lives. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless you and your loved ones, guiding you through every dark moment into light.